I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Steve Cates. He's lecturer in economics at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. For those of you who don't know, that stands for Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, and it's one of Australia's leading universities. However, unlike, I must say, a lot of academic economists, Steve's actually been involved in the real world for a significant part of his career. He worked for 25 years for the Australian counterpart of the CBI, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And in that connection, he was responsible for making lots of submissions to the government and trying, no doubt, to explain elementary principles of economics to the Australian political class. I don't know if that was as difficult as it would be doing the same job over here, but I must say I don't envy him that kind of job. No doubt that's one of the reasons why he's now moved on into the world of academia. He's published a number of books, including most notably a book on Say's Law and the Keynesian Revolution in 1998, which is, in my view, a much needed book. I think it's always worth trying to rehabilitate Say's Law from the unjust slurs thrown upon it by John Maynard Keynes back in the 1930s. And he argues in this book that, in fact, we've lost a great deal by forgetting the insights of that way of thinking about particularly business cycle and market balance. What he's going to do tonight is talk to us about something which is apart from a book that in fact is being co-published by the IEA in the near future, and he's going to talk to us, as the thing you hear about, is the axioms and fundamental principles of a free market economy, something which I'm sure many people, although maybe not in this audience, need a great deal of educating about. And so with that, I'll hand over to him.
Thank you. I always have to apologize. I come from Australia, but I have a Canadian accent, so everybody go, oh, that's disappointing. But anyways, that's why I have a Canadian accent, even though I've been in Australia for almost the last 40 years. This is part of a book that's being co-published by the IEA. It's called Free Market Economics, an Introduction for the General Reader. And the title is actually taken from a book which I think is the best book written in the 20th century on economics by a fellow named Henry Clay, who wrote it in 1916. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. And it's called Economics, an Introduction for the General Reader. And it was published 1916, reprinted 1917, 1919, 1920, 1921, 1922, 3 times 1924, all the way through to 1942 when there's a second edition. And then there's 3, 1942, 1, 1943, 1944. And then it disappears because of Keynesian economics. So suddenly the Samuelsons of the world take over and Clay's economics disappears. I'd always wanted to write this book, and I'd had many years ago kind of an agreement with Edward Elgar that I could get around to it, to write this book, and he would publish it. And I played with it, and until finally, that I was moved over, went to academic world, still played with it, couldn't quite get it right, and then there was a GFC, and at the end of 2008, I said to myself, I could no longer teach a course in economics, a macroeconomics course, and it was on teach Keynesian economics. So I just said to my class at the beginning of 2009, folks, I'm going to do this chapter by chapter each week. I'm just going to write you one new chapter, and that's the origins of this book. I just wrote it because to write a book on Keynesian economics, just to teach C plus I plus G, one more time in the middle of an international economic catastrophe, and one in which was going to be made worse with certainty because of the application of Keynesian principles to the problem, that I just simply said this is it. And so what I've done is I've put together a book that just was all the thoughts that have been in my head about all the economic issues. It looks in some ways like an introductory text, but mostly it's not. So it is an it's an introduction for the general reader. And you can actually go, I think the first 70, 80 pages doesn't even have a diagram, which I can hardly believe. But at the start of it, I have what I called my axioms and free and fundamental principles of a free market. And I have 5 axioms. And I was sitting there with my children yesterday talking about these axioms, and they say, but that's just obvious. And I was saying, but the point about an axiom is that they are obvious, that there's nothing in them that should look to you as odd or difficult. It should just simply be something that if it's just true, and you know it's true. But the whole point about these fundamental axioms is that once you know what they are, and once you appreciate that they are true and that they exist in the world, you cannot actually imagine having an economy, unless it is a free market economy, that will operate. And so it's these fundamental axioms, that are the key to understanding why it is that the only way you can run an actual economy in the world we live in is to have a free market economy. Now, first of all, a free market economy is one in which virtually all production decisions are made by individual entrepreneurs and not by governments. You have, unfortunately, a mentality that's growing and growing that government direction is the way things ought to be, and that government should be doing more of that, and that a government organized and directed economy, even though we've left the old Soviets behind, you can see in the ways that governments are behaving that they think they can lead it. And what the GFC actually did was sort of bring out of the woodwork all those attitudes that exist that we can make this economy grow, we can do all these things. And I don't know how it's working here, but certainly in Australia, because they think they've had this fantastic success dealing with the GFC, they think more and more that governments should be leading the way. You watch the United States with its stimulus, that again the Obama administration is one in which they think that more and more that government stimulus can do it. So that if you're going to have an economy that is going to be run on free market principles, then you have to appreciate that free markets are the foundation for prosperity and political freedom, and without free markets you cannot have either. And this is again, I worry that an understanding of how the world actually operates that is sort of leaching out of the way people think. So let me get to the first of those principles. Now, you sort of teach this thing, you say, come on, okay, I'm going to now teach you the first thing. Have your students come in, get their first class to say, look, nobody knows the future. It's kind of like, right, so like with my children. Yeah, nobody knows it. Of course nobody knows the future, so what? The way I often teach this is that all decisions are made in the present. In fact, I try to emphasize this. It's very difficult to actually get people to appreciate that all decisions are made in the present. And so what I tell them, as I said, the point I make is, suppose you're sitting on a train, and you got your back to the engine, and you're looking out the window, and the only thing you know is what you see out the window. And in that way, the only thing you know is what's already happened, what's already passed. You do not know what's going to come as you're going to move up the track. Now, why is that important? And the reason it's important is because of the possibility of error. Once you build time into it, once you build the fact that the world exists as it unfolds, and so that all you can know is what's happened in the past, you can know everything up to this moment, and every single economic decision you make will be a decision based on some conjecture about the future. That many of those decisions, and often, as you can see with the GFC, some really profound decisions turn out to be wrong. Having a free market economy is one in which you ensure that the incentive structure, that the people who have to make decisions in the face of all of this uncertainty have a tremendous amount of pressure on them to get it right. Governments aren't like that. Others aren't like that. Leaving it to the market is what does that. So because people will really worry that they do get it right. And you also have the system in which people who don't get it right are kind of eliminated from actually using productive resources. So that the incentive structure plus the way that the world actually weeds out the wrong decisions is why you just say nobody knows the future, therefore there is no other way to run the economy except to use some kind of technique that will allow people to sort of probe into the future by their present decisions in the way that will actually work for them. Everything is always in the process of change. If there's ever been a concept in economics that really works badly for understanding economics, it's the concept of equilibrium. That everything is just sort of moving towards some kind of point of stasis. Supply and demand, where the price ends up, move the demand curve and the price goes instantaneously from one spot to another, where you can just know what's going to happen. As it happens, there's a change in supply, and then that happens. When in fact what really goes on in the world is that everything is changing all of the time. New things are being invented, old things are disappearing. There are, as each time you make a decision, someone over there is making a decision. All these decisions are turning out in some kind of different milieu. The whole thing is moving along. There is no moment at which the whole thing comes to a rest, where things are standing still. And in the middle of that, again, this is where the entrepreneurial decisions and individual decision making really matter. Because in a world in which everything is always in the process of change, it is crucial to have some kind of structure in which those changes, as they're happening, are being accommodated by everyone who is in the process of thinking about what am I going to do, what shall I do next. Now this is, if you know Austrian economics, you know Hayek, you know that this commercially useful knowledge is diffused everywhere across the economy. This is the crucial role for the entrepreneurial activity. That when I take it your normal socialist view, or those who kind of want to fix the system, they look out there and they see a running system. They see a world that is just upgrading. There's businesses here, there are input producers there, and it's just out there happening. And they think, and in fact this is always kind of what Lenin thought, that it was just like a piece of cake to find just some way to organize it. You don't want to make shirts, you just get people together with sewing machines and material, and away they go. You want to make steel, just have the steel producers. When in fact the way the world actually works is that the kinds of knowledge you need, the kinds of innovation that are out there, what sort of new sorts of things you can do, they exist far and wide. What an entrepreneurial and what a business and private sector does is it brings together conglomerates and pools of information that are relevant to a particular enterprise. It brings the skills, the technique, the technologies that are out there. And they're brought together by someone who knows, who starts the process of bringing these knowledgeable people together. And in the end, you end up with a kind of structures, which is called businesses, that actually are able to do the productive work. Getting the knowledge that is at hand into the most commercially useful formats is one of the great and difficult tasks an economy has in front of it. And yet, when you know that all this knowledge is not actually brought together by the will of Mount Olympus, but requires individual decision making to do each of those pooling of those kinds of knowledge and theories and technologies and whatever, then again, the only kind of an economy in which this kind of outcome, the kind of productive outcomes that we're looking for, can actually take place, is one in which there is a private sector. Number 4. I sort of, even looking at this, think of this as quite different than it should be. Without prices that reflect scarcity, no one can tell what anything costs. Without market prices, no one can tell what anything costs. But again, it comes to the same idea, and that is this, that out there are just resources. There are buildings, there are people, there are whatever there are out there. They're out there in the world. But what you need is some form to tell you what would be the least costly way of producing something. And what does it mean to be least costly? Least costly means it's the way in which you use less of your productive potential in any particular enterprise. And the more you bring the cost of any individual activity down, the lower its average cost, the more output of all the different kinds of things you can produce. So that what you need is some mechanism to tell you what is the cheapest way, the least costly way of doing some kind of productive activity. And the only way this can be done is having a system in which you produce with prices. Prices actually reflect relative scarcity. And the only way you can have a system in which prices reflect relative scarcity is have a system in which market prices are determined by private sector firms which are trying to keep their own cost to a minimum. And if you go not just to that final output, but each and every one of the inputs into the production process, right across the whole economy, everybody's trying to minimize costs by using prices, which are always, of course, shifting. The minimization of costs, firm by firm by firm, keeps costs down for the whole of the economy and makes productive activity as prosperous as you can possibly have it. In the commercial world, everyone does best for themselves. This is your self-interest. This is everybody acts in their own best interest. Strangely, in teaching this into an introductory class, it's kind of annoying, they say, everybody should be nice to each other. But the point that I try to make with this is that we live in an economy of total strangers. That when some producer out in the middle of China is deciding what to produce and selling their output into the Australian economy, they're not thinking about anybody in particular. They're not thinking personally. It's not a personal decision. The kind of world we live in now, we are not dealing with personal decisions. We are not walking down to the high street, talking to your friendly butcher, or usually not. Whatever you buy, whether it's clothes or food or housing or whatever, you're buying it from people who you do not personally know. So that a commercial world, in the commercial world in which we live, in the free enterprise kind of economy in which we live, the only kind of relationship you're going to have for the vast majority of what is produced will be this distant relationship, not a personal relationship, but one between total strangers. And recognizing that you are now dealing in a world of production in which it is total stranger dealing with total stranger, that you have to have some kind of intermediating structure, which is what the private sector and free enterprise, the market economy, is all about and trying to do. So having these 5 axioms, I then go to the 10 principles that really make up what is the nature of a market economy. And the first one, I always try to emphasize this to my students and wherever I go. It is that No one runs a free enterprise economy. It runs itself. It's just out there. It is doing it, so you do not need someone on the top. You know, the management of the economy, the way an individual business, say, is run, someone on top is making the decisions. A market economy is one in which it just runs itself. At the end of the year, we have GDP statistics, and you can say such and such was produced in total value, such and such. You might even have some statistic to tell you how much of particular items were produced at the end of the time. But no one knows in advance what's going to get produced. It is just something that unfolds by the processes themselves, because the economy is just being run in a free market way. And it's more than that. It's like, that's how it ought to be. Within the laws, everybody's decisions are personal and private. The shape and structure of the economy is not designed by anyone. An economy like this is one in which everybody makes their own decisions for themselves. This is what is expected. No one is told what to do. It just, everybody's trying to find their way. Self-interest is what sort of guides people into the particular endeavors, the particular things they do. And having an economy in which self-interest is the guiding principle, this free market orientation, is the way in which an economy not only is expected to work, but will work and can only work in that way. Businesses are the spontaneous creation of the members of the community. Again, you know, many of my students back home are Chinese, and it's actually a something that, from a Chinese point of view, from my Chinese students' point of view, it's not something they see. That so many of the businesses they see in China are the state-owned enterprises, rather than being something that is just set up by themselves. Whereas my Australian students, of course, everybody knows, often they're just the children of people who have run their own businesses. In a free enterprise economy, which I'm always trying to emphasize, anybody can open up a business. Anybody can be that person. I say, you know, when Bill Gates was your age, he would just sit in a class like this. Anybody could be that person who one day will go out and just produce and open up a business of their own and create that kind of enterprise. They are spontaneous. They are not designed. When you come out and you look at the world out there, you see all these different enterprises. But every one of those enterprises, whether it was Coca-Cola or BHP Steel, began as a very small enterprise and grew out. And that's just how economies do unfold. This one, you know, it is a kind of a strange thing for me now to deal with people who don't entirely see this. There is an attitude that is actually quite disturbing for me, to find that even in the middle of the GFC, there was this belief that the government, in coming in on top of all these individual private sector decisions and making those decisions and going and saying, oh, we'll set up this and have a stimulus there, that rather than being some kind of problem, is actually at the very core what people wanted governments to do. They thought, at long last, we're not going to have the anarchy of the market. We're going to have some kind of rational decision-making going on. We're going to end up when the economy will be pushed in the right sort of direction. There is no doubt in my mind that the American president has this kind of attitude. He thinks that it will be better for the American economy that the government is now owning or did own, or will own, or should own, or could own a car company, rather than just leaving it to individual private business people to respond to the market. So that what you end up with is this attitude that I find, like I say, disturbing, that quite a lot of people do not see that businesses are infinitely more likely to make good commercial decisions than government. What you actually find now are lots and lots of people who think that governments do make the better decisions, and that we do need the governments in there making those decisions. And it is one of those problems, I think, that is going to come back. The more this attitude it becomes entrenched, it's going to come back and make things even worse than they are. Now, there is a role for government. The book I put together actually emphasizes it, rather than being even saying necessary evil. It's a necessary good. If government is doing the right sort of things, is an essential part of what makes an economy actually function. And the most important economic role of government is to provide laws and regulations that encourage private sector economic activity. What governments are to do is to create an economic environment by creating rules, regulations that are sympathetic to the operation of the economy. That the 19th century, more or less, did evolve, the rules, the regulations, and the commercial law evolved in response to the circumstances of the world. But the aim of all that evolution was to make businesses and commercial enterprises more productive. That was the aim, and that was the outcome. The circumstances today, as we move into the 21st century, is actually all the way different. That governments are coming in on top. That government regulation is one that is specifically not designed to make businesses work better, but it's actually the kind of the mentality that sits behind it is to say that business left to itself will just simply create problems and not provide the goods and services we want, will provide lousy products, poor performance, the whole lot. And instead, what you need is a government to come in and to come in on top and to make that difference. And the emphasis I tried to make is that governments have neither the knowledge nor the expertise to make good business decisions, and it is not something that is readily acceptable to all too many. So what this book is trying to do is try to point out that if you're going to have a system in which low-cost products, innovation, improvements in our standard of living become routine, then what you need is a private sector that's actually allowed to get on and get that job done. Now this is something quite dear to my own heart. This is, as you go farther into the book, you find much more on this, and this is a kind of very abstract way of describing what is Say's law. And it is that the goods and services bought in the economy are financed by the sale of goods and services sold in the economy. Part of what this book really does try to do is to sort of emphasize that what causes demand, what actually is the underpinning for demand, is actually supply. My children always say this, you know, goods buy goods. They were just, that they recognize this, that out there is a process in which each person individually produces something, exchanges what they produce for something called money, and then use that money to buy something else. So out there, unless you have a system in which the demand is created by that supply, this is that essence of of the Say's law market, where production demand is determined by production itself. You actually haven't got an economy in which things will exchange. If business in aggregate produce what buyers do not want, which is the opposite side of this, then what you get is a downturn. An economy that the only way an economy can actually stay on course and keep growing is if each individual producer produces what other people want. And when the economy doesn't produce what other people want, as you had with the American housing crisis and the GFC, then you end up with all kinds of incomes being earned for producing things that created no value. And as soon as production and incomes are being earned for things that did not create value, what you end up with is the economy actually tipping over into recession. This is your classical recession. This is not your Keynesian recession. This is a classical recession where there are problems in the structure of production, and when the structure of production goes out of phase, parts of what is being produced simply have to disappear. Now this form of words is that classical understanding of how things work. Goods and services bought are financed by the sale of goods and services sold. And related to that is that money gets its purchasing power only and essentially from the fact that it actually is the other side of a sale transaction. So that we have this thing called money. We use money to buy with. In a kind of classical world, in a kind of a market world, the money that each of us has that we can use to purchase with is money that's been earned by producing something for somebody else. In an economy that is growing and not contracting and continuously moving forward, every time someone has produced something and sold it, the money they received actually has the value that's contained in the value of what was sold. We now have lost that sense of it. That if you look at the QE2 and the whole notion of how we're going to just expand the money supply without at the same time expanding the productive enterprise behind it, and not expect inflation. I mean, it was sort of funny to pick up the paper yesterday and say, oh, look, there was surprising growth in CPI the other day. Why it should surprise anybody, and certainly amongst the economics community, that you end up with inflation when you had this vast growth in the money supply is what is a surprise to me. That unless the money itself represents some kind of underpinning productive activity, it can be nothing other than inflation. Again, you know, it's sort of one of those things where I honored often in the breach than in the observance, that you have production decisions should be left to businesses to make for themselves. No one plans an economy from above. The whole notion of how an economy actually operates is essentially in terms of business individually looking out in that world, this uncertain world out there, and trying to determine what it is they could actually make a profit from selling. So these kinds of production decisions have to be left to the market. What we have in Australia right now is just this strange example of the government deciding that the Australian economy needs a national internet network, and they're now going to spend 43 billion, which to us is just an astounding amount of money, building a broadband network for Australia. When the figures actually show that if left to commercial decision, you could have something that will give you the same outcome at 1/6 the price, is something that is being just ignored, because as far as the government is concerned, it will be better if it does it. It will be one of these great things for the people of Australia, and that it does not, and it's not something that we should worry about, that it is going to do it. Instead, it believes that these kinds of business decisions can be a good part of what governments do, and it can direct the economy in that way. Same thing with these investment decisions. Investment decisions should be left to business to make for themselves. That it is not the role of governments, not the responsibility of governments to come in and second guess what businesses ought to be doing in terms of what investment they should be undertaking. That it is a again, to some extent, to a large extent, there is no problem anymore seen and recognized with governments instructing business what it should do, what it should not do, how it should regulate, how things ought to be done. And then finally, pricing decisions. So again, that last one, pricing decisions should be left to business to make for themselves. It is again a problem that you have, that you've got to remind governments they should not be telling businesses what to do. They should not be telling business what prices ought to be charged. That again, you have to say to the governments, you should keep away from all the business kinds of decisions, whether it's investment, whether it's production, whether it's pricing, that there is nothing that a government has to offer in getting itself involved with. All it can do is distort and slow things down. It can never improve things. Yes, okay, well, my 39 minutes up, but I'll just go and say a couple of things here. And that is that no one lives in a laissez-faire economy, and no one has ever lived in a laissez-faire economy where governments haven't been involved. And in fact, what I actually think is that economics is a branch of politics, that economics and economic decisions are always tempered wherever you are, whether you're in Britain in the 19th century or China in 2011, that these decisions are tempered by what the government will or will not let you do.